Before we continue, comment below which city or country you're watching this video from. They laughed when she walked into Fort Bragg wearing combat boots 2 sizes too big. They whispered when she stumbled during the first morning run. But nobody laughed 5 seconds after General Marcus Hale decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. Sarah Kendrick was 23 years old when she arrived at the U.S. Army Rangers selection course in North Carolina. She came from a small town in Montana, where her father ran a hardware store and her mother taught kindergarten. Sarah had never fired a gun before 17, never ran more than a mile without stopping, and never imagined she'd be standing shoulder to shoulder with men who looked like they were carved from granite. But she was there because of a promise she made to her younger brother Tommy before he died of leukemia at age 14. He'd asked her to be brave enough for both of them, so she showed up, underweight, undertrained, and completely underestimated. The first week was designed to break people. Sleep deprivation, endless physical punishment, psychological games that made grown men cry into their pillows at night. Sarah barely survived. Her hands bled from rope climbs. Her knees swelled from carrying logs twice her body weight. The other candidates mostly ignored her, except for a few who looked at her with something between pity and annoyance. She was the only woman in a class of 47 men, and every single one of them knew she didn't belong. General Marcus Hale had been in the Army for 32 years. He'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen classified operations that would never appear in any official record. He was a legend, a man whose mere presence could silence a room full of rowdy soldiers. He had 3 rules he lived by: discipline above all, weakness is contagious, and women belong in support roles, not combat units. When he heard that a female candidate had somehow passed the initial screening for Ranger selection, he took it as a personal insult to everything he'd built. On day 9 of training, during a hand-to-hand combat demonstration, General Hale decided to make an example. The instructor had been showing proper defensive techniques when Hale stepped onto the mat, his boots heavy against the rubber surface. He pointed directly at Sarah, who was standing in the back row trying to make herself invisible. "You, front and center." Sarah's heart stopped. Every eye in that gymnasium turned toward her. She walked forward, her legs feeling like they were made of wet sand. When she stood in front of the general, she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of scars along his knuckles. "Show me your combat stance," he ordered. She positioned herself the way she'd been taught, feet shoulder-width apart, hands up, weight balanced. Her form was actually perfect, but Hale didn't care about form. He cared about sending a message. "Pathetic," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think that's going to stop an enemy combatant? You think some terrorist is going to go easy on you because you're a girl?" Sarah kept her eyes forward, jaw clenched. She knew this game. She'd played it her whole life. Every time a coach told her she wasn't strong enough. Every time a teacher suggested she'd be better off in nursing than engineering. Stay quiet. Don't react. Survive. But General Hale wasn't finished. He circled her like a predator, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're taking up a spot that could go to a real soldier. You're making this entire unit weaker just by being here. And when you fail, and you will fail, you'll go crying back to whatever safe little life you came from, and we'll have wasted weeks of time and taxpayer money on your little feminist fantasy." The room was silent. Some of the other candidates looked uncomfortable. A few looked satisfied, like they'd been thinking the same thing but didn't have the rank to say it out loud. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she kept them at her sides, kept her breathing steady, kept her eyes focused on a point on the wall behind the general's head. "Nothing to say?" Hale stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat coming off his body. "That's what I thought. You people are all the same. Loud mouths until someone actually challenges you." Then he did something that changed everything. He reached out and shoved her shoulder, hard, a gesture meant to humiliate rather than harm. It wasn't a punch or a strike, just a dismissive push, the kind you'd give to a child who was in your way. Sarah stumbled back half a step, and for a moment the general smiled, satisfied that he'd made his point. What happened next took exactly 5 seconds. Sarah didn't think. She didn't plan. Her body simply reacted with muscle memory that had been drilled into her by an older cousin who'd taught her Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu starting when she was 12 years old. Her cousin Erica had been a competitive fighter before a car accident ended her career, and she'd spent years teaching Sarah that size didn't matter if you understood leverage, timing, and the human body's natural weak points. As General Hale's weight shifted forward from the momentum of his push, Sarah dropped her center of gravity, stepped into his space rather than away from it, grabbed his extended arm with both hands, and executed a textbook arm drag that redirected his force against him. Before his brain could process what was happening, she had rotated his shoulder joint into a compromising angle, stepped behind him, and applied a standing shoulder lock that put him completely off balance. His own forward momentum combined with her precise technique meant that within 2 seconds, General Marcus Hale, decorated war hero and 32-year veteran, was face down on the mat with his arm locked behind his back, in a position that would snap his shoulder if he resisted. The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Instructors rushed forward. Candidates stood frozen in shock. And General Hale, his face pressed against the rubber mat, gasped out words that nobody expected to hear. "Stop! Let go! My shoulder! Get her off!" Sarah released him immediately and stepped back, her face pale, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and terror. She'd just assaulted a general. Her military career was over before it had even begun. She was probably going to jail. Her mind raced through every possible consequence while her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. 2 instructors helped General Hale to his feet. He rotated his shoulder, wincing, his face red with a combination of pain and humiliation. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Every person in that space was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. General Hale just stared at Sarah. She kept her eyes down, expecting to be screamed at, court-martialed, thrown out of the program in disgrace. She thought about calling her parents, about explaining why she'd failed, about Tommy's face when she'd promised to be brave. Then General Hale did something nobody, least of all Sarah, expected. He started laughing. Not a cruel laugh or a mocking one, but a genuine, surprised, almost delighted laugh that came from deep in his chest. "Where the hell did you learn that?" he asked. Sarah looked up, confused. "My cousin, sir. She taught me Jiu-Jitsu." Hale nodded slowly, still rotating his shoulder. That was a clean technique. Very clean. He looked around at the assembled candidates, his expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. "How many of you saw what she did?" A few hands went up hesitantly. "She didn't use strength. She used my own force against me. She didn't fight me. She redirected me. That's smart combat. That's what we're supposed to be teaching you." He looked back at Sarah, and for the first time there was something like respect in his eyes. "You could have dislocated my shoulder just now, could have really hurt me. Why didn't you?" "Because you're my superior officer, sir," Sarah said quietly. "And because I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here to learn to protect people." Something shifted in that moment, not just in General Hale, but in the entire room. The energy changed from hostile to curious, from dismissive to attentive. Sarah had just done something none of them had managed in all their years of training. She'd surprised the general, humbled him, and done it without ego or malice. What Sarah didn't know was that General Hale's entire military philosophy had been built on a foundation of personal trauma. 15 years earlier, in Kandahar, his patrol had been ambushed. A female translator attached to their unit had frozen under fire, and 2 soldiers died trying to protect her. Hale had blamed her ever since, had let that single incident shape his entire worldview about women in combat. It was easier to believe all women were weak than to accept that one frightened person had made a mistake in an impossible situation. But Sarah hadn't frozen. She hadn't panicked or overreacted. She'd responded with perfect technique, perfect control, and perfect discipline. She'd done exactly what a soldier should do, neutralize a threat efficiently and without unnecessary harm. And she'd done it to him, someone with 3 decades of combat experience. Over the next week, something remarkable happened. General Hale didn't become Sarah's champion overnight. He didn't suddenly start advocating for women in combat roles or give speeches about equality, but he did start watching her more carefully. He saw how she stayed late to help other candidates who were struggling with knot tying. He noticed how she volunteered for the worst details without complaint. He observed how she approached every physical challenge not with brute strength, but with intelligent problem-solving, finding mechanical advantages and efficient movement patterns that worked with her body type rather than against it. During the land navigation exercise, when most candidates were getting lost in the North Carolina pine forests, Sarah finished in the top 5 by actually reading the terrain features instead of just following compass bearings blindly. During the medical training, she was the only one who correctly identified a pneumothorax simulation and performed the needle decompression without hesitation. And during the final patrol exercise, when the team leader candidate made a tactical error that would have gotten them all killed in a real scenario, Sarah spoke up, politely suggested an alternative route, and probably saved the entire exercise from failure. But the real test came on day 43, during what the instructors called the black phase. Sleep deprivation was at its peak. Food was scarce. Every candidate was running on fumes and sheer willpower. They were doing a 48-hour field exercise that simulated being behind enemy lines with limited supplies and constant harassment from the opposition force, instructors playing the role of enemy soldiers. Sarah's team was exhausted, moving through swampland in the middle of the night, when one of the largest candidates, a guy named Derek Martinez, who stood 6'4" and weighed 240 pounds, stepped wrong and went down hard. His ankle twisted with a sound like a breaking branch, and he collapsed into the muddy water, crying out in pain. Everyone froze. They were 3 miles from the extraction point with at least 5 hours of movement still ahead of them. Protocol said they should call for medical evacuation, but that would mean failing the exercise for the entire team. Derek looked up at them through gritted teeth and shook his head. "Leave me. Seriously, don't blow the exercise because of me." The team leader, a former college football player named James, looked torn. Carrying Derek would be nearly impossible. The terrain was brutal, the timeline was tight, and everyone was already at the edge of physical collapse. Sarah was calculating in her head, running through options, when she noticed something the others had missed. They were near an old logging trail, barely visible but there, cutting through the swamp at an angle that would shave at least 2 miles off their route, if they could navigate it correctly. It would be risky, potentially against the rules since they were supposed to stay in designated training areas, but it might be their only chance. "We're not leaving him," Sarah said firmly. She looked at James. "But we're not carrying him either. We're going to make a litter, use the logging trail, and redistribute gear weight. We can make it." For a moment, James looked like he might argue, but something in Sarah's voice, the absolute certainty of it, made him nod instead. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah directed the team like she'd been doing it her entire life. They constructed an improvised litter using ponchos and tree branches, loaded Derek onto it, redistributed all the heavy gear among the strongest carriers, and began moving at a pace that shouldn't have been possible given their condition. What they didn't know was that General Hale was watching. He'd been monitoring the exercise from the operations center, and when Sarah's team deviated from their assigned route, he'd personally driven out to the logging trail to see what they were attempting. He watched through night vision equipment as this exhausted team, led by a woman who weighed less than the pack she was carrying, navigated through darkness and mud with discipline and coordination that would have impressed a veteran unit. They made the extraction point with 11 minutes to spare. When they emerged from the tree line, covered in mud and nearly dead on their feet, but with every single team member accounted for and moving, General Hale was standing there waiting. He looked at Derek's swollen ankle, then at the improvised litter, then at Sarah, who was swaying slightly on her feet from exhaustion, but still had that same focused look in her eyes. "That was against protocol," Hale said. "You deviated from the assigned route." James started to speak, probably to take responsibility, but Sarah interrupted. "It was my call, sir. The team needed adaptation, not adherence. We didn't lose the mission or the man." Hale was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the pre-dawn light. Then he did something that shocked everyone present. He came to attention and saluted her. Not the casual salute of everyday military courtesy, but a full formal salute of respect from one soldier to another. "Outstanding work, Ranger candidate," he said. "You just taught every person here what leadership actually looks like." Sarah returned the salute, tears suddenly burning in her eyes, though whether from exhaustion or emotion even she couldn't tell. Around her, the other candidates stood a little straighter, looked at her a little differently. She wasn't the weak girl anymore. She wasn't even just a female soldier. She was a Ranger candidate who'd earned her place through competence, courage, and character. The rest of the course was still brutal. Sarah still struggled with some of the physical requirements. She still faced doubt, criticism, and testing that seemed designed specifically to break her. But something had fundamentally changed. The other candidates started coming to her with questions, including her in their pre-mission planning, treating her as an equal rather than an exception. And General Hale, who'd spent 3 decades believing women weakened combat units, found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew. He started reviewing selection criteria, not to lower standards, but to ensure they were testing the right things: tactical thinking, stress management, teamwork, and problem solving, not just raw physical power. He reached out to the female translator from Kandahar, the one he'd blamed for 15 years, and learned that she'd gone on to save dozens of lives in subsequent deployments, earning a Bronze Star for valor. His narrow judgment had been based on one moment of trauma, not on any real evidence. On graduation day, 63 days after she'd arrived at Fort Bragg wearing boots too big and carrying dreams too heavy for her shoulders, Sarah Kendrick stood in formation with 11 other candidates who'd made it through the course. Out of the original 47 who started, they were the survivors, and she was one of them. When her name was called and she stepped forward to receive her Ranger tab, General Hale himself pinned it to her uniform. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear and said, "Your brother would be proud. Hell, I'm proud. Welcome to the regiment, Ranger." Sarah thought about Tommy, about his pale face in that hospital bed asking her to be brave, about every person who'd ever told her she wasn't enough. She thought about that moment on the mat when she'd reacted on instinct and accidentally taught a general that strength comes in forms he'd never considered. She thought about Derek on that litter, about the logging trail in darkness, about choosing adaptation over protocol. But mostly she thought about all the girls out there who were being told they couldn't, they shouldn't, they weren't built for it. She thought about standing here in this uniform as living proof that courage doesn't have a gender, that competence earned is competence respected, and that sometimes the people who look weakest are the ones strong enough to carry everyone else home. The ceremony ended with the Ranger Creed, all 12 graduates reciting it in unison, their voices carrying across the parade ground. Sarah's voice was the quietest, but it was also the steadiest, each word a promise and a declaration. Recognizing that I volunteered as a Ranger, fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession, I will always endeavor to uphold the prestige, honor, and high esprit de corps of the Rangers. General Hale stood at attention watching them, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Later that night, he would write a letter to the Department of Defense recommending changes to combat role policies. He would cite specific examples, including a certain candidate who'd taught him more about leadership in 5 seconds than he'd learned in 32 years. He would admit he'd been wrong, which for a man like Marcus Hale was perhaps the bravest thing he'd ever done. But in that moment, he simply saluted the new Rangers, these warriors who'd earned their place through blood, sweat, tears, and unwavering determination. And when his eyes met Sarah's across the parade ground, there was a mutual understanding there, a recognition that they'd both been changed by what had happened in that gymnasium. 5 seconds. That's all it had taken to transform humiliation into opportunity, to turn a teaching moment into a learning moment, to prove that the person you underestimate might be the one who saves your life someday. Sarah went on to serve with distinction, leading teams in situations where quick thinking mattered more than bench press numbers. She became an instructor herself eventually, teaching new Ranger candidates that there are many forms of strength, many paths to excellence, and that the person next to you deserves your respect until they prove otherwise, not the reverse. And whenever she taught hand-to-hand combat, she would tell the story of a general who thought he was teaching a lesson but ended up learning one instead. She'd demonstrate that same arm drag, that same shoulder lock, and she'd explain that in combat, in leadership, in life, it's not about being the strongest or the loudest or the most feared. It's about being the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most willing to keep fighting even when everyone has counted you out. Years later, Sarah would receive a letter from General Hale, retired by then and living in Arizona. In it, he thanked her for her service, but more importantly, he thanked her for the gift she'd given him on that mat. The gift of being wrong, being humbled, and being given the chance to become better. He wrote that she'd made him a better leader, a better teacher, and a better person. Sarah kept that letter in her uniform pocket through 3 deployments. She carried it the same way she carried Tommy's photo, as a reminder that courage sometimes looks like a 23-year-old girl in boots too big, sometimes looks like a general admitting he was wrong, and sometimes looks like choosing to carry your brother home instead of leaving him behind. The weak girl who walked into Fort Bragg that first morning had been transformed, not into someone different, but into the fullest version of herself. She'd been tested by fire, by prejudice, by physical demands that seemed impossible, and she'd emerged not just as a survivor, but as a leader, a warrior, and living proof that the limits we place on people are usually reflections of our own limitations, not theirs. And somewhere in Montana, in a small cemetery next to a hardware store, there's a gravestone with Tommy Kendrick's name on it. Sarah visits it whenever she can, wearing her uniform with its hard-earned ranger tab, and she tells him about the mountains she's climbed, the battles she's fought, and the lives she's saved. She tells him she kept her promise. She was brave enough for both of them, but the truth is she'd always been that brave. She just needed the chance to prove it, 5 seconds to show what she was made of, and a general who was wise enough to recognize strength in a form he'd never expected to see. In those 5 seconds, 2 people were changed forever. One learned what true discipline looks like, and the other learned that her courage was never in question. It was everyone else who needed convincing, and in the end, they were convinced, not through speeches or arguments or political debates, but through action, competence, and the undeniable reality that when the mission matters, when lives are on the line, what counts isn't what you look like, it's what you're made of. And Sarah Kendrick was made of steel, determination, and a promise to a dying boy that she would be brave enough to change the world. If you believe that courage has no gender, that strength comes in many forms, and that the person who looks weakest might be the one carrying everyone else home, comment honor below.